Thank you for listening, Amplitudes for Two listeners. It's Isaiah Allen, aka Lil Zay News, and I'm here at News Team 2 Station, and I'm actually going to interview Chief Meteorologist Fowler and to see what he has to say about Hurricane Ida, as well as hurricane and tropical storm systems, as well as what got him into meteorology.
Apple juice for two. Apple juice for two. Apple juice for two. Apple juice pour deux. Je pour deux.
So, how did you become a meteorologist, and what got you into studying meteorology?
You know, Isaiah, it's kind of interesting that we recently had Ida make landfall in and around the New Orleans area, and that brought back memories for me because I was born in New Orleans. In 1965, we had Hurricane Betsy. I was born in '60, so I was 5 years old when Hurricane Betsy came through New Orleans. And I remember we had to go to my grandparents' house on the other side of town because their house didn't flood as much as our house did. So we stayed the night of Betsy at my grandparents' house. And my job that night, my grandparents gave me a job, was to take dry towels and stick them right under the front door to try to keep the water from coming into the house. Mm-hmm. So as a 5-year-old child, I was absolutely petrified, terrified. I heard the metal bending outside. My grandparents had a carport, not a garage, so you heard that metal, corrugated metal bending. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that at that time I knew I wanted to be a meteorologist, but what I do know is I wanted to learn more about science and weather and hurricanes and all those kinds of things at that very moment. And now when you heard a lot about Ida, you heard a lot of comparisons to some of the flooding from Betsy and, of course, Katrina.
Right.
So Betsy came back to the forefront, going back, 50 years later.
What are some of the misconceptions that people have on hurricanes? Because I know some people are less willing to evacuate. I know in this case, I think a lot of people from New Orleans actually did evacuate. But I know in Charleston, when we had 3 or 4 years consecutive of hurricanes, what do you think there are people, or what's something that you can tell the people that would maybe, I guess, inform them to maybe consider evacuating?
That's a great question, and there's an answer to that. And every tropical system is different. Mm-hmm. So you can't say, oh, I went through Hugo, I can weather this storm because right. Hugo is a 4, this is a 1. Mm-hmm. Here in Charleston, we have inherent issues anyway. We could have a full moon on a sunny day, right. And you've got flooding in downtown.
Yeah.
So bring a tropical storm or a hurricane in there, or even a tropical depression, Isaiah. It doesn't have to be a named storm. Mm-hmm. And if you bring additional rain during a time of the year when you've got high tides and you've got flooding anyway, it's going to create some major issues for Charleston. So I tell people, you can't use one storm and say, well, I did this and I weathered that storm, I stayed. I'm not going to leave for this one because it's a lesser storm, when in reality it could cause more issues than the previous storm.
So I know how you kind of mentioned how infrastructure has a definite impact on towns when, like I said, a hurricane or a tropical storm or tropical depression affects them. So would you say that there's, I guess, similar infrastructure from New Orleans as to Charleston? Because I know, like you said, Ida was obviously a devastating hurricane, and then right. Katrina. And then when Hugo happened, I'm assuming there's a little commonalities between the two in terms of flooding and other issues that they had.
Yeah, and Iowa was a situation where unfortunately it didn't go very far in 24 hours, so the floods continued. Thankfully, the levees stood up to most of the water, and that did not happen during Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, going back to growing up in New Orleans, Isaiah, that was always a bone of contention. Mm-hmm. That in New Orleans we got to spend money to fix these levees, and another project came and they said we don't have the money, we have to do this first. Mm-hmm. And it kept being put off, and of course Katrina kind of finally caught up to everybody. Hugo was moving more than 20 miles an hour. So even though Hugo was a devastating storm, mm-hmm. the flooding aspect was not as great because it was moving so quickly, mm-hmm. as opposed to Ida, which got on land and just crawled for 24 hours. I think it spent a whole 24 hours in Louisiana, the center of the storm. Jeez. Keep in mind now, you've got rain bands expanding hundreds of miles away from the center. So yes, the similarities in the sense that there was a lot of wind, there was some water with Hugo, but certainly not as much as there could have been had Hugo been moving slower.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you're well aware of the situation that happened with the reporter when a random bystander just came and confronted him. Yes. I didn't hear exactly what he said on that broadcast, but has anything similar to has anything similar happened to you? And how would you think you would address that situation?
Yeah, I saw the video, and it was in Mississippi, and a reporter was talking about the storm, and a guy got out of his pickup truck and ran over and was accusing them of making the storm bigger than it was and not telling the truth and all that. And I think part of that is now in the video age, people are seeing all kinds of things. I know we saw Jim Cantori from the Weather Channel in the storm, and he could barely stand up, and then people kind of walking behind him like it's a regular sunny day. But keep in mind now, Jim was in between buildings, and he was in the wind tunnel, as opposed to these guys on either side of the road. There was a building blocking the wind from them, from really creating issues for them. So, but for me personally, most people are very, respectful. I've never been on the scene and someone came up and accused me of, but we have young reporters, and when they come in and they ask me how to cover a storm, I said, you just tell what you see. Don't embellish it. If it's just a branch slowly blowing in the breeze, you can't make up and say, oh, the winds must be 50 miles an hour when people look at it at home going,
Right.
probably not. So you want to make sure you're as truthful as you possibly can. You're the person on the scene. Tell what you see. Tell what's going on. And if you don't know exactly how strong the wind is, then probably not mentioning the specific wind speed.
Right, gotcha. So how long have you actually been working for News 2, and what are some of your favorite moments actually being on air here?
Oh, great question. In September will be 34 years. I came from Green Bay, Wisconsin, where you know my family, Isaiah, and I met my wife, Cara, there.
Right.
And then just got to Charleston, and I got here in '87, September of '87. 2 years went by, and Hugo happened, and
Right.
the management came to me and said, "Hey, Rob, we just went through Hugo together. We want you to continue here as our chief meteorologist." And I signed a new contract, and the kids were born, and they loved it here. We loved it here, and all of a sudden, 5 years became 10, 15, 15, 20, and then 34 years.
Right.
The question about what's some of my favorite moments, I think just the fact that we've been here so long, we've met so many great people, our kids have met so many wonderful people, and we've had those relationships fostered over the years. Being on TV is great. Charleston's a really fun town to live in. It's paradise, I think. We live in a place that people want to come and visit.
True.
And so when you tell people you're from Charleston, more times than not, it's like, oh my gosh, I love Charleston, or oh my gosh, I want to visit Charleston. So everybody has this great feeling about Charleston, and you're like, hey, how cool, we get to live here. We grew up here, you grew up here. So so it's one of those things that just living in this place and working in TV is fun. Going to schools is great, because now I'm talking to generations. I'm talking to kids of kids. I talked to maybe a second grader many years ago, and now that second grader's grown up and they have kids who was a second grader, and they'll remind me, my dad said you came to his second grade class. And people ask me when I'm going to retire. Probably when someone comes up and says, my grandfather said you came to his second grade class, that might be time to step away.
So this is kind of a little bit off question, but I know since you're a meteorologist, I had to ask, what are your favorite types of clouds?
Well, it depends on what the clouds are. I love cumulus clouds, the cotton ball clouds. They have to have a flat base, and they have to be growing horizontal. If they're going up, they typically turn into what we call cumulonimbus clouds, and we don't like those. But I just, in fact, I was coming back to work, and I don't think this ever gets old, Isaiah. And I was driving to work. I come from my house 17 towards the bridge, and right behind the bridge, there was a cloud formation, and I swear to me, it looked like a giant alligator. It had, the jaws, and it had the head, and I think you always like to look in the clouds. It doesn't matter how old you are, and see what shapes you see. But cumulus clouds, just because those are probably the ones that most people know. Cirrus clouds are the ice crystal wispy clouds that are the higher level clouds, and then the stratus clouds usually are associated with dark, gray kind of drizzle and those kinds of things. So I'm going to take the middle. I'm going to go right in the middle. I'm going to say cumulus.
So what advice do you have for aspiring meteorologists, or I guess people who might be interested in pursuing a job in the news broadcasting world? What advice from someone who's been in the field for 34 years, what advice would you give them now?
It's changed a lot, Isaiah. The whole landscape has changed. When I first got into business, there were 3 TV stations. there was the newspaper and some radio stations. Now you've got all the cable networks, you've got all the social media aspects, all the websites that people can go to. So the piece of the pie, which used to, you get 3 big pieces, now you've got a little sliver. So the number of people watching local news is diminishing because they're getting their news elsewhere. So you have 2 choices. You can kind of wither and die, or you can find those people. And that's where our website comes in. So for anybody getting into this business, I would say, make sure you're versed in social media, you're versed in website, content, your TV part. It's long hours. Unfortunately, to begin with, it's low pay. It's a calling. It really is. It's not just a job. You have to love it to stay in this business. And we've had some folks that have come and said, even though they got their communications degree, they got here and they said, this is not really for me. And I appreciate that and understand that and respect that. But for those of us who have been in, it just gets in your blood, and you like the job because every day it's something different. 5 minutes from now, something could happen, Isaiah. There could be a big story, whether it be a news story or weather story. And I like that. I like not knowing that, nothing wrong with the same job every day where you go into an office maybe and you're kind of filing things or you're working on spreadsheets. Hey, I appreciate that too, but our job, just like that, something could change on the dime and all of a sudden your whole focus changes to something different. Well, what's interesting is right now as we're taping this podcast, we're kind of in the middle of hurricane season. We've gone through, June, July, August, and we're moving into September, which is our peak month. So we've got a long way to go. But for the rest of the year, I think it's still going to be very active. What we can't predict are landfalls. But what I can tell you is looking at some of the modeling as of this time we're taping this podcast, next couple of weeks, knock on wood, look good for us. There's going to be a lot of troughiness over the East Coast. That basically means some dips in the jet stream. Anything that gets close to us will probably be steered away. So we're going to keep our fingers crossed that is the case. But we're not done. I'm always reminded, probably more times than ever, is Hugo did not come off Africa as a storm or even a cluster of thunderstorms until September 9th. And then 12 days later, we know where it ended up. So I'm still looking at every wave coming off Africa, not knowing maybe this is the one, could be the one. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. If it doesn't happen this year, there's going to be another big storm that we're going to have to deal with here in the Charleston area. Yeah, one thing about New Orleans, they had to build those levees because New Orleans is below sea level. A lot of the city is below sea level. And Charleston we're just a little bit above, but not much.
Okay.
So Waterfront Park is about 7 feet above sea level.
Okay.
So that's why when we say the tide is going to be 7 feet, that you're going to see water in the road. A tide of 7 feet is very typical during new and full moon phases. So that's not unusual. So it's almost like being below sea level in a way. So, but yes, they've recently rebuilt the battery wall there to help protect some of the crashing waves. So hopefully that will come into play. But it's more times than not that people just need to know what the threat potentially is. That's our job to disseminate that threat. And if your area floods during a high tide on a sunny day, if it floods then, there's a good chance that we have a landfalling tropical system, it's going to be even worse. So you need to take that into consideration when you make a decision whether to leave or stay. And I personally don't tell people leave or stay, Isaiah. I just kind of put all the cards on the table. Here's the hand that you're dealt, and I'm going to let you take that hand and play it the way you want to. But I'm going to give you the information you need to make a decision that could be, a life-saving decision for you and your family.
Right, and that's even something that we actually like to enforce in the podcast, where we present the information and the stats and the statistics. And we don't want to tell people, we want you to think this way, but we want people to interpret it their own way. So in your case, like you just said, we don't want, go ahead and evacuate. We have a Category 3 hurricane. You need to evacuate. You just want this is information, this is what the storm system is going to look like, this is going to happen with the surge and the waves. So do as you will, do what you want. So
that's a great way to put it. And that's what we try to do, give you the information. Obviously, you can see it in our eyes and you can hear it in our voice. If it may be that's taking that next step and getting to that next level. Watching the meteorologist in New Orleans as it was approaching, you could hear in their voice and see in their faces. So you don't need any graphic to tell
Right.
you it's going to be very clear that it's very serious.
Like from your expertise, would you say there's a rise in the temperature of the planet?
I think there's no doubt, Isaiah, that things are changing,
Mhm.
that the Earth is getting warmer. What I can't really, back up all the time is that, people blaming global warming for certain weather events. I mean, we've had extreme weather events for billions of years.
Right.
It's just now in this age that we're in, you're seeing them on video and you're hearing stories and they're shared on social media and those kinds of things. So it may seem bigger than it is. But I think there's no doubt that the Earth is getting warmer. We have good, hard data showing that. The ramifications are, if the Earth is getting warmer, sea level is going to rise because the ice caps are
Right,
melting,
right.
the glaciers are melting, the water levels, the oceans, if they stay warmer longer, that's what fuels these tropical systems. So that, in a sense, right there is yes, that these storms could eventually be stronger. And also keep in mind now that the population is growing. So
Mhm.
there's a lot more people in harm's way.
Right.
So when you're talking about a storm hitting Charleston now compared to 32 years ago when Hugo hit,
Mhm.
I know the population of Mount Pleasant back then was about 15,000 people. Now it's 90,000.
Right.
So that's a lot more people in harm's way. So your responsibility is made even greater to give people the information. What I can say about that is I went to a conference one time, and you always kind of pick out things that really make sense to you and talks to you. And there was a professor, and he was talking about global warming and climate change, and he said, people blame, there was more hurricanes or stronger hurricanes, and he said, really, you can look at the data. It's very decadal. It's every 30 years you have a big spike in tropical activity, and that is true. So it's not necessarily the global warming that's doing that. It's just a natural
Mhm.
way the Earth and global, patterns change from
Right.
year to year, decade to decade. But again, if I think there's no doubt that we are getting warmer, and down the road the ramifications are going to be quite extensive. This is what's left over
From Ida.
From Ida.
Okay.
So this is it stops at 7 o'clock in the morning, but it's probably more. Here, I'll show you. I'll go get a radar picture, which is better. Let's see. Here, I turn. Oh, I'll leave those lights on. Takes a little while. There's a lot of
A lot of graphs to load in.
Yeah, we need a new computer but you see, these are showers that are it's like a cold front coming through as well.
Mhm.
So it's some of Ida leftover moisture,
Okay.
but it's also, you can see, you can see the circulation with Ida, and you see the rain shield goes all the way up into Pennsylvania.
Oh my God.
So you see where Tate is, some of that rain, it looks like most of it's going to be in this corridor here,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll see this little wave of storms moving through. We'll see if that holds together for us later on tonight and tomorrow. But this is the cool thing about the radar. And then if let's go back. Let's just go back last 48 hours. Might take a while to load, but yeah, you can see
Right.
48 hours of movement.
Jeez.
From the tropical system.
Mm-hmm.
But this moving through Tennessee, which just had floods near Nashville recently, so that's not helping.
Do you have any storms in the Atlantic right now?
So there is one that we got to keep an eye on. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal
Mm-hmm.
because I think it'll get steered. Oh, here. I lost it. Let's see if I can pull out on this one. I had a graphic I was looking at. I don't know where it went. So I was off yesterday, so they may have moved it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's one in the far eastern Atlantic that we've got to keep an eye on. There it is. Okay. I just moved it into yeah, this one right out here. So there's a
Right.
high likelihood that's going to become Larry.
Okay.
And this is 5 days out, so it's not really moving, and it's pretty disorganized. This little area in the Caribbean, that might form. That's a low possibility. This is Kate, so this is actually a named storm, but it's already showing tendency to move north. And then, of course, the remnants of Ida, right here.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's the cool thing about technology too is, we can see these storms, as clusters of thunderstorms over Africa. So we have plenty of time to watch them.
Right.
So we're not going to be surprised by a tropical storm or hurricane. Now, forecasting intensity is tough. That's probably our biggest challenge. Forecasting track. I think when they look at the data 5 days out, they're going to find that Ida probably came within 40 miles of where they predicted it would be 5 days before, which is pretty darn good. Because when you get 5 days out, you're talking about a margin of error of roughly 200 and some change, 100 miles. So if you can narrow that down to 40 miles,
Right.
then they really, the models, the computer models that you always see, the spaghetti models, they were really locked in to that Louisiana solution early. But that's the best part about the technology is, with the satellites we have today, we can see things.
Right.
And we can see how they're forming, we can see how they're moving. So it's not going to be a surprise. So if anybody says, "Oh, it came out of nowhere," it's probably not, unless they were under a rock and just watching. More times than not, we're going to be able to give you some lead time.
Apple juice for 2. Apple juice for 2. Apple juice for 2. Apple juice, c'était pas un pot de.